Exodus 17 and 18, the latter half of Exodus 17. And here, for the first time, we see that the Israelites interact with other nations. Up until now, the Israelites have been a part of the kingdom of Egypt, so to speak, though they were slaves. However, they have now left Egypt, and they are now a nation unto themselves. A nomadic nation, that is a nation that does not have any territory as of yet, but a nation nonetheless. So this raises a question. How will the other nations in the world react to what has happened? And this is an important thing to realize. The Israelites were the people of God. They were God's chosen people. How the nations relate to Israel directly reflects how these nations relate to the God of Israel. And so, as we will see, there are only two options. You will either rebel against this God, or you will worship him. In Exodus 17:18, we will see two polarizing responses to the nation of Israel, and correspondingly two polarizing responses to the God of Israel. First, we'll see the Amalekites oppose Israel, and then we will see Jethro, who is the priest of Midian, worship. And the key point I want to make tonight is, as we see a visceral and polarizing response to the Israelite people, there is also a polarizing response to the God of the Bible. And I hope you understand that this was true here in Exodus 17, with roughly 3,500 years ago, but it's just as true today, and it is just as true in our own hearts. Why is this? I believe this is because in our very nature we understand that if we acknowledge God for who he is, the Creator God, the God of the heaven and the earth, if we understand that, we have to know in our being that we will either bow down to worship him, or we will rebel against him, or we will reject him entirely. There is no middle ground. And with that, let's dive into our text. Israel and Amalek. This is the first part we're going to look at, and this is in the latter half of Exodus 17. So, verse 8, we hear that Amalek comes up against Israel. It says, "Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim." The first question we might ask is, oh boy, does this go backwards? There we go. Sorry, skipped ahead a bit. The first question we might have is, who is Amalek? The Bible actually answers this question for us in Genesis 36, where it tells us that Esau, and you remember Jacob and Esau had a son called Eliphaz, and Eliphaz has a son by his concubine Timnah, who was called Amalek. On Friday evening in our family devotions, Rebecca, Kate, you listening? Do you remember on Friday evening, we did our family devotions and we read about Jacob and Esau. And you'll recall that Jacob tricked his father Isaac into giving him the blessing that Isaac had intended to give to Esau. And when Esau came to Isaac, Isaac refused to give Esau Jacob's blessing. But he gave him a different blessing instead. And this is what Isaac said. "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall be your habitation, and away from the dew of the heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall be when you become restless that you will break his yoke from your neck." Now, I'm not saying that this blessing given to Esau in Genesis chapter 36 is what we're reading about tonight. But it does show that there is a multi-generational conflict between the sons of Isaac and the sons of Esau, just as there is a multi-generational conflict, for example, today, between the sons of Isaac and the sons of Abraham, which are, of course, Isaac and Ishmael. So the latter conflict, the conflict between the sons the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael, that conflict is still happening today. With the modern day children of Isaac and Jacob presently at war in the Middle East. Well, Amalek will continue to be an enemy of Israel for many years. But this is the first time when Amalek directly comes against Israel. This is the first time they are challenged as a nation by another nation. This is the first time Israel as a nation is being challenged by another nation. And it's interesting that this is the first interaction they have with another nation, is opposition. Now, consider the situation. Israel is an enormous nation. God has blessed them and they have been very prosperous. There are now around 2 million people traveling in the wilderness. They are currently at Rephidim, which we're not sure exactly where that is, but as far as I can tell, it's in the land of Midian. You see, I got the picture. This is from many weeks ago. But I think it's probably a little bit towards the north of the territory of the land of Midian. And to the north of Midian is the land of Edom. And you will recall that Edom is the country where the descendants of Esau lived, and that would include the Amalekites. Over there, the nation of Amalek is kind of shaded blue, and that's kind of where we suppose that they were. Now, where the Israelites are now is, if I may move here, I think they're somewhere around here, which, as you will note, this is not the territory of the Amalekites. At least that's as far as we can tell. That's not where they are. Where was I? Now, I don't know exactly why they decide to attack Israel, but we'll see in a few verses that by this time, the news of what happened in Egypt has spread around the ancient world, so to speak. This would lead us to believe that they knew that the Israelites were a nation made up entirely of slaves, and that they likely had zero combat training, and they certainly had zero combat experience. One would wonder that the Israelites had any weapons at all, seeing as the way in which they fled out of Egypt. But of course they did, and we can recall that they received many gifts from the Egyptians as they left. But the Amalekites are probably looking at this nation of ragtag bunch of slaves. Even though there are very many of them, they, for some reason, thought that they could overcome them. Furthermore, you can imagine that having 2 million people roaming your land would have an impact. And we will see this in the future. Israel will be opposed by people in the future as well. And you can imagine you're a farmer in Limpopo somewhere, and you hear that 2 million people are going to come across your land. You would say, like, I would prefer if they not come this way at all. And you can imagine that if you could do anything to dissuade them from coming your way, you might be desperate enough to do that, even if it meant going to fight them. So perhaps the Amalekites were worried that if the Israelites were to come their way, that the same fate of the Egyptians were utterly destroyed, would befall them. So they perhaps go to fight the Israelites, to nip this whole thing in the bud, and to keep them away. Well, whatever the reasoning is, we can understand two things. Firstly, Amalek decided that they wanted to come and fight Israel. Secondly, they likely knew what happened in Egypt, that Israel had come out and left Egypt in utter ruin behind them. Now let's see what happens. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose men for us and go out. Fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will take my stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So this is the first time we hear of Joshua. Joshua, of course, will eventually be Moses' successor. And he is one of only a very small handful of adults who will survive the next 40 years in the wilderness on account of his steadfastness and unwavering faith in God. And here Moses charges Joshua to choose men and to go and fight against Amalek. Furthermore, Moses says he is going to go up on a hill with the staff of God in his hands. It is interesting to me that he calls it the staff of God. As you recall in Exodus 4, this is actually Moses' staff. Staff, sorry. My wife is American. Now you remember the staff, this getting stray bullets from the side. Now you remember the staff. God turned the staff into a snake and then turned it back into a staff. And if you go and read the text, after God does that, Moses calls it the staff of God. And today Moses is going up the hill with the staff of God. And what this shows us is that even though Moses tells Joshua, go and pick some men to fight, he is not putting his faith that Joshua is going to do something miraculous. He is trusting that God is going to do something miraculous. And so this is his expectation. Verse 10 continues, Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. See, Aaron isn't even going to fight with his men. He's going with Moses. So it came about when Moses held up his hand, you can imagine his hands, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. So Moses goes up the hill and he holds up his hands. You can imagine him holding a staff like this. And he's holding the staff above his head. And when he takes his hands down, Amalek prevails. And when he lifts his staff up, Israel prevails. Verse 12 says, but Moses' hands were heavy. And so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on either side of him. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. What is the significance of this? It may seem kind of random at first, but if we dig a little deeper, we shall see that this is a continuing theme throughout the book of Exodus and to our study tonight. And the theme is this: God gets the glory. God gets all the glory. Isaiah 42 verse 8 says, I am Yahweh, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. God is the one who gets all the glory. And why do we draw this conclusion? Look at verse 12. Moses' hands were heavy. The word heavy here carries the same meaning as glory. In the Hebrew, words actually sound almost the same. The word for holy in Hebrew is kabod, and the word for heavy is kabed. Note that it doesn't say Moses' hands get tired. It says they were heavy. It doesn't mean his hands weren't tired, but that's not the word it uses. It's using the word heavy. And this is drawing our attention to the glory of God. Moses has his hands raised up towards the heavens with the staff of God in his hands, showing that God gets all the glory. What does this mean? This is faith. To have faith is to believe that the best thing for any situation is for God to get the most glory. Now, this is a continuing theme throughout the Bible. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. Now, this is more than a pithy statement. You know, we throw these things around. I know, do everything for the glory of God. If you accept, this verse, it means that you believe that the best thing for any situation is for God to get all the glory. And ask yourself, do we live like this? How do we make decisions? Do we decide what to do and then we kind of hope God gets glory? Or do we sit down and say, I'm going to decide what to do based on what will give God most glory? Maybe we do what we want to do and then we convince ourselves it will glorify God. It is a difficult thing to accept, especially if there's something that we really want or something that we really want to do. But tell yourself, teach yourself. Don't let your emotions pull you in every which direction. Tell yourself, I'm not going to do what I feel like doing. I'm going to actively decide to do whatever is going to give God the most glory in any situation. The rest of chapter 17. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heaven." Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." So Israel defeats Amalek this time. And God says to Moses to write down and remember the promise that Amalek will be wiped out completely. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about this portion. It's very interesting that God tells Moses to write something down, seeing as the very idea of writing did not exist really in that time. But let's not go down that road for now. We will be here all night. Moses builds an altar and worships. We can assume that the whole nation of Israel was involved in this event. Moses proclaims to the whole nation that God has vowed to utterly destroy Amalek by Israel's hand. From here on out, Amalek will be an enemy to Israel. They are sworn enemies and rivals to the bitter end. Spoiler alert, when does Amalek get destroyed? Anybody want to guess? This is a tricky one. The truth is Esther, the book of Esther. You will remember Haman, who in the book of Esther plots to destroy all the Jews, was an Agagite, which is another word for Amalekite. And him and all of the other enemies of the Jews meet their end at that time. So, spoiler alert for, let's see, how far are we going to go from Exodus all the way to Esther? But how do we think about all of this? Now, there are two ways to respond to God. Either in worship or in rebellion followed by destruction. The Amalekites were confronted by Israel, which is the nation of God. This is like saying the Amalekites were confronted by God. Undoubtedly, the Amalekites knew of what happened in Israel, that the God of the Israelites had led them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And yet their response was to come against this nation for war, and as far as I can tell, not even in their own territory. This will be a theme throughout the Bible and throughout all of history, really. God's enemies rebel and are eventually destroyed. God's enemies go up against him, even though, if you look at it from the outside, it seems like insanity. Like if you look at what happened here against the Amalekites, you'd be like, Israel just came out of Egypt, and Egypt which is much greater than Israel from man's perspective. They were enslaved by the Egyptians, and yet Egypt has been completely decimated by the God of the nation of Israel. And your response to that, the Amalekites' response to that is, let's go fight them. And then they are destroyed. Now think about this. How do you respond to God? Do you fight against him? Or do you worship him and give him all the glory? Do you resist him even though you know it's fruitless? Be careful. You may be counted among those who in the last days will call out to the mountains to fall upon you, lest you be consumed by a more dreadful enemy. As the Bible says, it is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So that's it for the Amalekites for now. Now we come to chapter 18 of Exodus. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now you'll recall, as I said before, that it is more than likely that the Amalekites had heard what happened in Egypt. And this is why. Jethro, who lived in an arguably more remote area, had heard about what transpired in Egypt. And look what exactly it is that Jethro had learned. He had heard of all that God had done. That's what it says, right? Yes. Of all that God had done. So Jethro had heard that the Israelites had been freed, which is to say that this knowledge had spread throughout the ancient world. Now, I don't think this verse indicates that the whole world, and even Jethro at this point, knew that the God called Yahweh, the God called I Am, was the one who led the Israelites out of captivity. But this verse does indicate that this is part of what God is doing. He is proclaiming to the whole world that He is God who delivers His people with might and power and an outstretched arm. Note that Jethro is referred to as the priest of Midian. Recall that, and you will notice it throughout the Bible, that when the Bible calls somebody a priest, it lends a theological context to the passage. It indicates that here learning is going to take place. Theological learning is going to take place. Previously, in Exodus 4, we saw that Moses received instruction from Jethro. There he was also called the priest of Midian. Today, there will also be instruction, but it will be quite different. Regardless, the fact is that Jethro is referred to as a priest gives us context for this passage. It has theological context. In this passage, there will be instruction. However, before we get to the instructions, there are some things we need to note. Verse 2. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away. Jethro had heard that Moses and the whole nation of Israel was around, and he brought back Moses' wife and children. Now, we don't know exactly why Moses had sent his wife away. We could assume that it was a practical reason. For example, it was possible that the things that were happening in Egypt was too dangerous, too chaotic, and so he sent his wife and children away back to his father-in-law as a precaution. Regardless of whatever the reason is, Jethro saw that Moses had come near to where he was, and so he saw this as an opportunity to come and meet Moses and bring back his wife and children. The next few verses are interesting. Jethro brought back Zipporah and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliezer, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Now, the first son we've already heard about in Exodus 2. But this is the first time we hear about the second son, Eliezer. Now, I'm not entirely sure of the timeline of events of when exactly this son was born. However, I think it is safe to say that it was before he left Midian to come to lead Israel out of Egypt. Because in Exodus 4, it mentions that Moses left with his wife and sons, plural. What is interesting about these verses is that we have already known about the first son. So when in Exodus 2, it mentions Gershom, and it says the same thing, because I was a sojourner in a foreign land. But the second son's name is only mentioned now in Exodus 18. And the reason for this is not insignificant. Previously, the first son was named because it indicated that Moses had come to understand that he was a sojourner in Egypt and in Midian, and that his destiny and the destiny of Israel was the land promised to Abraham. The second son here is mentioned because it is relevant now. It is a fulfillment of a prophecy, so to speak. Eliezer means God is our help. And the passage tells us that he was named so because God delivered Moses from the sword of Pharaoh. Now, this not only shows us the faith that Moses had when he named his son, which, as I understand, was at least before the Exodus, but it also shows us that Jethro bringing them back to Moses indicates that the purpose for these children's names have come to fruition. The purpose for their naming has come to be fulfilled. God has delivered the people Israel, including Moses, from the sword of Pharaoh. And what's more, Jethro comes to Moses in acknowledgement of this. He acknowledges, Jethro comes to Moses acknowledging the man that Moses has become. When he left Midian, ever long ago, he left a sojourner. Now he comes back as a nation. Verse 5. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was camped at the mountain of God. This verse gives us a little context. We are now at Mount Sinai. We'll learn next week more about that, but the focus right now is not that they are camping at Mount Sinai, but that Jethro had come to visit. The reason this is discussed now is because it goes with the previous passage of them fighting against Amalek. It may seem strange, it may seem that this is not related, but think about it. This is about the way the nations relate to Israel, the way the nations respond to the God of Israel. This is the context. In chapter 17, we saw how God's enemies, Israel's enemies, respond, and here we see another response to God, to the nation of Israel. We see another way a foreign nation, so to speak, relates to Israel and the God of Israel. This is why this is here. This is our context for our study tonight. Verse 6. And he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Note again the asymmetry from the past. In the past, Moses came to Jethro. Now, Jethro comes to Moses. We've seen this kind of asymmetry with Pharaoh as well. For 10 plagues, Moses repeatedly comes to Pharaoh. If you read the passage, it keeps telling us Moses goes to Pharaoh. Moses rises up in the morning and he goes to Pharaoh. Then after the 10th plague, Pharaoh sends word to Moses. This is a recognition of strength and power. The lesser approaches the greater, not the other way around. Jethro here sends word to Moses, the greater one, that Jethro is coming. Jethro is the one leaving his home, packing up his things, and his daughter and his 2 grandchildren, and he is coming to Moses. He is acknowledging that Moses is greater than him, that the nation of Midian is inferior to the nation of Israel. Verse 7. Then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other their welfare, and they went into the tent. This shows us that there is mutual respect and honor between Moses and Jethro. Jethro comes, and he is received as a friend, as a family member. This is an emotional and heartfelt reunion of 2 people who were more than just friends. They were family. The passage says they asked each other of their welfare, and the Hebrew word will be one that I'm sure you recognize. It's the word shalom, which means welfare, peace, and soundness. And it again emphasizes that there's a strong, positive relationship between Jethro and Moses. Furthermore, remember the context. This is not only how Jethro relates to Moses, it is also how a foreign nation relates to Israel as a nation. And you'll see this more in detail to follow. Verse 8. And Moses recounted to his father-in-law all that Yahweh had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how Yahweh had delivered them. So they go into the tent. And here is where theological learning takes place. Moses is instructing Jethro. Now, it doesn't sound like that. Moses here recounts all that God had done for him. You may be wondering, how is this theological learning? I thought theology is about textbooks and big words, big doctrines and whatnot. We use words like predestination and atonement and propitiation. But this isn't correct. Theology is very simply learning about God, learning about who God is and what He has done. Sometimes it means learning about the way God would want us, His people, to live. But even that is merely a reflection of who God is. As Peter 1 verse 15 said, "But like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your conduct, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." So Moses here tells Jethro of all the things God has done, of who God is, of how God has delivered the Israelites from the hand of Pharaoh, just as the name of Moses' son Eleazar indicates. What's more is that you have to understand that what they are doing in this context, it's learning theological instruction, but it is more than that. It is worship. What they are doing is worship. They are worshiping. Think about our worship service. What do we do other than sing songs, pray, and read the scriptures, telling us and telling each other about what God has done and what He will do, about who He is? This is what Moses and Jethro are doing here. Look at verse 9. "And Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which Yahweh had done to Israel, that He had delivered them from the hand of the Egyptians." Now, note, this is why I'm telling you, this is why this is here. The Israelites are suddenly at Sinai. It's almost as if there's an introduction missing. And we'll see next week when it talks about them coming to Sinai, it's more of a leaning into them coming to Sinai. It's almost as if this is not exactly chronological what's happening here. And the reason is because this is relating to the previous passage of them fighting against Amalek. When Amalek, we saw open and visceral hostility against Israel, and in that against God. Because at that point, who is Israel apart from the nation that God has led out of Egypt with a mighty hand? But here we see Jethro confronted by the same information, and how does he respond? He's not an Israelite. But how does he respond? He responds in rejoicing. We begin to see the second response to Israel as a nation. The first we saw Amalek, whose response was hostility. Here we see Jethro respond in rejoicing. He rejoices when he hears how God has destroyed another nation. He rejoices when he hears about who God is. He sees what God has done for Israel, what God has done to Egypt, as an unequivocally good thing. Verse 10. So Jethro said, "Blessed be Yahweh, who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods, for in this matter they acted presumptuously against the people." Now notice Jethro's response. Blessed be who? Blessed be Yahweh. He is specific. He has now learned about the God called I Am. And so Jethro's response, once again, is worship. Blessed be the Lord who delivered you. Blessed be the God who saves. Now this comes back to the introduction which I took out, but this is the kind of polarizing response we tend to see. What Jethro has just been confronted with is the knowledge that God has completely destroyed one nation and led another nation out of captivity. And Amalek's response is, we don't know this for sure, but the response is, we must destroy this nation, or we will be next, I assume. And Jethro's response is, what an amazing thing God has done. And we will come back to this, but this is how people respond to God today. It is a visceral and hostile response, or it is worship. There is not really room for anything in between. Now at this point you may think that the only reason Jethro is happy is because he is related to Moses. That the only reason Jethro rejoices with Moses is because Moses is Jethro's son-in-law, so it's his family. But verse 10 makes it clear. Jethro says, "Blessed is the Lord who delivered you, Moses, from Pharaoh." And then he goes on and says, "and who delivered the people from the Egyptians." We can see that the focus is not Moses, it is God. It is true for the first half. This is true for the first half of chapter 18. The focus is primarily on God, who God is, and what He has done. Then in verse 11, Jethro says, "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods." This language is language of faith. Jethro here expresses faith in God. He has heard about what God has done, and Jethro's response is worship and faith. "Now I know that there are none like God," Jethro says. Then verse 12 concludes this section. "Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came out with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God." Here the focus zooms out again. The context is the nation of Israel and Jethro representing a foreign nation. Here we see them worship together. Jethro here takes a burnt offering, and we also see Aaron and all the elders of Israel come together in this event. This is the involvement of the whole nation. And they have a meal together. Why is this significant? This is a celebration and remembrance of the things God has done. And what has God done? He has delivered His people from the hand of their enemies. This subtly points back to the Passover, which was a meal taken in anticipation of the deliverance God was going to accomplish. And it subtly, not explicitly, it subtly looks forward to a very different meal many years later, where Jesus tells His disciples to remember. To remember what? To remember what God has accomplished in Christ, that He has delivered God's people from the hand of their enemy, the great enemy, sin. Now, it is important for us not to miss that this again is part of the great overarching scope of God's salvation. What happens here in Exodus 18 points all the way back to Genesis 22, all the way back to Genesis 2, to 22 specifically, where God made the promise to Abraham. "Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have listened to my voice." Interesting how we have seen these promises acknowledged in this evening's study. We have seen Israel triumph over their enemies, the Amalekites. We have seen how Jethro, a nation not Israel, a nation counted under the heading of all the nations of the earth, rejoices and proclaims blessings of God because of God's deliverance. This once again is a picture of the salvation of God which is to come. How all the nations of the earth will be blessed because of the deliverance of sin from Jesus Christ. So, we saw two things from the Abrahamic covenant acknowledged, and now for a third. Israel has become very big. It's a bit of a stretch, but let's take it. Israel has become very big. In the scope of the sands of the sea big. Millions of people. And this is relevant as we come to verse 13. "Now it happened the next day that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening." Here we see one aspect of Moses' leadership of the Israelites. It involved judging. From the morning till the evening, Moses sits and he hears the people's problems and judges. That is, he applies the law of God. Now at this point, the law of God has not yet been given. Again, I assume this might not be exactly chronologically at this point, but let's take it as it comes. Regardless, this is a secondary focus. What the focus of this second part of chapter 18 is that Israel is governed by laws, not by Moses. Up until this point, Moses was the main man for Israel. He has represented Israel before Pharaoh, and next week we shall see Moses represent Israel before God. However, Moses is not Israel. Israel is not to be ruled by the man Moses and his descendants. They are to be ruled by the truth, which is to say the law of God. Let's look at verse 14. And Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, and he said, "What is this that you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge of all the people and stand about you and they stand about you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor and make known the statute of God and his laws." And Moses' father-in-law says to him, "The thing that you are doing is not good." Very interesting passage. And I'm quite confident that SMTI references this passage and how he counsels somebody. But that's not what I'm going to go into tonight. Jethro here observes what Moses is doing. And so he comes to talk to Moses. He asks questions. This is the counseling part. He asks Moses, "What are you doing?" So Moses responds and he says, "Well, I sit here from morning till evening, and the people come to me with their issues, and then I tell them what God says, and I decide for them between a man and his neighbor." So Moses, he sits and listens. He takes God's law, which we presume he knows, and he applies it to judicial matters for the people. And so Moses' father-in-law tells him, "This is not good." Very interesting wording. You should do a Google search for that word, "not good." The only other place it is used in the Pentateuch is Genesis 2. It is not good for the man to be alone. The connotation is, of course, deliberate. This is not an accident that those words are used. In Genesis 2, it is not good for the man to do his work alone. He needs a helper. Here in Exodus 18, it is not good for Moses to do his work alone. But the meaning goes much deeper in Exodus 18. Why is it not good? Verse 18. I have not yet read verse 18, so I will skip it for now. This is a pivotal concept about the Bible. God's purpose has never been and never will be for people to rule other people. This is true not just for Israel, but for the whole human race. It is not good for people to rule over other people. God's design is for people to be ruled by the truth, by the law of God, which is to say, we are to be ruled by God, His character, His attributes, who He is. Now, I said it's true for the whole world. The whole world does not have God's law, but the same thing is still true. It is not good when one man stands up and rules over a nation of people by his own authority. We need to consider this critically in our lives. We talk about like a hypothetical situation where there's a dictator and his heavy hand is on the people. But that's not our situation, fortunately. So how does it apply to our situation? We need to ask ourselves. These concepts have been relevant from the beginning of time until now. Are we ruled by the truth of God or by people? How do we think about governance? In our families, in our church, in our country. How do we relate to our elders? Let's apply that. Do you consider the things that they say as instructive to your walk with God? When the elders stand up here and teach you about the Word of God, do you consider what they say as instructive, or do you consider what they say as the very words of God? Are they a stand-in for God for you? Do you take whatever they say as if they are speaking the words of God to you? Do you read the Bible and try and understand how it relates to your life, and do you try and grow in your relationship with God? Or is that something that the elders do for you? You come sit on a Sunday and they're going to now give you God. The inverse is just as relevant. Do you take your frustration with God out on the elders? Ask yourself, if you're in a disagreement with the elders, you sit at home and you think about something that Pastor Sayron or Pastor Enrico has said, and you're like, I don't like what they said. Is it really about sorry, I'm pointing at Pastor Enrico. Is it really about what he has said? Or is the problem you have really with God? And you're taking it out on Pastor Enrico or Pastor Sayron? We've had conflict in the church recently, and a few people left the church. And in the process, some accusations have been leveled against the elders. Now when you think about these things, I want to encourage you to think, was the accusation against the elders, or was it really against the Bible? Was it really against God? Was the issue the Bible? Was the issue, what was at the heart of the problem? Was the problem the elders, or was it really the truth itself? This extends beyond the scope of the local church as well. Consider how you think about politics. I think this is becoming more and more relevant as time goes on. Do you tell myself, as long as my political party wins, everything will be set right? As long as my guy becomes president, everything will be all right? You hear people on the internet talk like this. When Donald Trump or whoever comes into power, he's going to put all these guys in jail. or Elon Musk. Elon Musk is going to set Twitter free. Ridiculous things. But these are the things we believe. We believe that guy, if only that guy was in power, everything would be okay. We have to ask ourselves the question, do we want to be ruled by men or by God? Is our hope in men or in God? So Jethro observes Moses ruling over the people all by himself, and he notices what Jethro notices in the situation. It's not his opinion that this is not good. He notices that something is incongruent. Something is amiss. Something doesn't quite make sense to Jethro as he looks at the situation with Moses. So what does Jethro see that doesn't make sense? He has learned that Moses rules over the people. He also learned that all that Moses is really doing is applying the things that God has taught him, applying the law of God. And so Jethro puts two and two together. If this was all about Moses, then of course Moses is the main man, and Moses needs to do all that he can do to take charge and keep these people in check. But this is not what's happening. You see, the people are actually ruled by the laws and statutes of God. And Moses, the faithful man, is applying this. In reality, they're ruled by God and His revealed truth. So Jethro understands that if this is the case, then in his words, this is not good. It's not good for Moses to be the main man if the people are not to be ruled by Moses, but by the law of God. Verse 18. You will surely wear yourself out. You will surely wear out, both you yourself and the people who are with you. For this task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. It is very problematic for Moses to rule over all these people. If his main responsibility is to apply the law of God for the people, firstly, everybody is going to get worn out. This is not sustainable, is what Jethro is saying. First of all, Moses is going to be completely overwhelmed and taking charge of 1 million people by himself. Secondly, we see interesting phrasing by Jethro. The task is too heavy for you. Again, same usage as in chapter 17. This is the second theme that joins these two passages together. The task is too heavy for you. The word heavy, remember, the connotation is glory. This task is too glorious for you. Applying the Word of God is a thing so glorious, so important, so significant, that it cannot be entrusted to just one person. So Jethro counsels Moses. I forgot to skip quite a few slides, I think. Sorry about that. You have been listening to things that I have talked about minutes ago. Now listen to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the matters to God. Then warn them about the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they shall go and the work they shall do. But you shall select excellent men out of all the people, those who fear God, men of truth, those who hate greedy gain, and you shall place these men over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they will judge the people at all times. And it will be that every major matter they bring to you, but every minor matter they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all of these people will also go to their place in peace. Again, the word shalom. Jethro counsels Moses to delegate this task of judging. It is not only too much work for him, but the task is too glorious, too heavy, too weighty for one man to do by himself. In verse 19 and 20, Jethro tells Moses that though God may bring revelation to Moses, the revelation is not ultimately meant for Moses. It is for the people of Israel. And ultimately the whole world. I mean, we'll come back to this. This is Jethro talking. He is not an Israelite. Jethro advises Moses to set up a system of courts. That's my word. Courts where people will judge based on the teaching of the law which Moses will give to them. Thus, it is the law that judges people and not Moses or any one person. It is interesting to me that every civilized country, that's my opinion, but I think it's objectively true, every civilized country in the world still organizes courts in roughly this way. If we take South Africa, for example, we have regional and district courts, which deal with less serious criminal and civil cases, like the small claims court and the labor court and so on. Then we have 13 high courts, which deal with specialized cases and other cases that the lower courts are not able to deal with. Then we have the Supreme Court of Appeal, which deal with cases sent from the high courts. There's only one Supreme Court of Appeal. And finally, we have the Constitutional Court, which is restricted in dealing with matters of the Constitution itself. Now, as I said, this is a critically important idea. The idea is that the judge of man is not a man. It is the truth. It is a law. It is the law. Even though our courts in South Africa do not judge people based on the law of God, they judge by the same ideals, the same principles. The ideals that all people are equal under the law. The law does not discriminate on matters other than right and wrong. That it also has the ideal that it is possible for people to judge one another objectively, as long as there is an independent standard by which we may agree on and be judged. And the situation here in Exodus 18 goes even deeper. It says that there is objective truth. We can know right and wrong. That right and wrong is something above and beyond any one man's interpretation. That God is the one who communicates this notion of right and wrong. That God is ultimately the one who judges us, not based on any external standard, but based on himself, his character, his attributes. We are judged based on who God is. Note that Moses is to select excellent men. This reminds us of passages in the New Testament about elders being qualified. Passages such as 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. This, of course, is not a coincidence. When Paul wrote these things, I have no doubt that he was thinking of this passage and other passages like it. You may not realize this, but Jesus has given the church judicial authority. I'm not making this up. This comes from Matthew 18. Now, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take 2 or 3 with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. Have you ever wondered what all that binding and loosing is about in this passage? The heaven and earth and the binding and loosing, and some people interpret that to mean all sorts of things it doesn't, but let's look at what it actually means. Matthew 18 verse 18 Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again I say to you that if two of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where two or three have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. Now, a lot of people have used these things in a lot of ways, but what it really is talking about is the judicial authority that has been given to the church. What Jesus says here, that God in heaven respects the authority of the church to deal with matters of applying the Bible, of applying the law, so to speak. If someone is out of line in the context of the church, the process of Matthew 18 calls back to the process outlined in Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, where it says, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on the account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. At the mouth of two or three witnesses, every matter shall be established. That's what it's talking about in Matthew 18. And this passage in Deuteronomy 19 calls back to Exodus 17, where the principle of judgment is established. The principle that people are judged by facts and not by opinions. I mention all of this to say that if you didn't think that Exodus 17 was relevant to you and me today, make no mistake. It is extremely relevant and important. I think we sometimes miss that we live in a country, South Africa, and we have a government, and they have all this power, and they have all their laws, and we sit here in our little churchy, and we're just our people here, and we have two elders, and we think that we are insignificant in comparison to the grand scheme of things that are going on in the world. But you have to realize that underneath God, who is in heaven, ruling over all creation, there is only elders under him. We have Jesus Christ in heaven, the chief shepherd, and he is appointed, like Moses is appointed, elders to take care of the flock, in a way delegating his responsibility of shepherding to others. What that means is, if you don't like what the elder says, the only other person you can appeal to is God himself. That is very, very significant. And that's why it's so important to understand this notion that we are ruled in our lives by the Bible, by the truth. And God has given us elders to shepherd us in that, to teach us in that, and to make judgments according to that about what is going on in our lives. And if we don't like that, there's no one to appeal to apart from God himself. These things are pretty serious. 5 minutes left. Verse 24 continues. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose excellent men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. The difficult matter they would bring to Moses, but every minor matter they themselves would judge. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. Now, as we come to the conclusion, let's take note of a few things. First, as we've said, the principle is that people are judged by the law and not by opinions. This implies many things that are fundamental to the way we understand the world, reality, and God. It means that there is such a thing as truth. Truth is separate from us and our opinions. It means that no matter what someone's opinion is, the truth is something separate from any one person. And where is the truth? How do we find it? Ultimately, in God's law. The truth about what is right and wrong. And we can know this truth. We can study the Bible and we can understand what is right and what is wrong. In other words, it is possible for us to understand and apply the Bible to our lives. It is possible, even though we are fallen people, to know the difference between right and wrong. Second, we see that it is God's will for the people of Israel to be governed by laws. That is to say, by the Bible. And we'll surely cover this again when we come to this laws again next week and the week after. This is about who God is. It's about his attributes. The people's lives, the people of Israel, their lives are to be saturated by the law of God, by the revelation of God, by the identity of God, by the attributes of God, by the character of God. To be God's people is to identify in the very way they conduct themselves by the revelation of God, which is ultimately the revelation of God Himself. And if it was important for Israel, how much more important is it for us, to be saturated in our lives, in our conduct, in the way we relate to each other, in the way we relate to our government, that we are regulated and governed and saturated by the Bible. Third, note, and this is where it comes back to the broader context, this is all coming from Jethro. This deep, comprehensive insight about the nature of the governance of Israel, something we still apply in our court systems today, has come from somebody who is not an Israelite. Comes from an outsider. What does this mean? It means that these things are self-evident. They are objectively verifiable. The way that Israel ends up conducting itself is not based on Moses' opinion, but of an independent third-party analysis of the thing God has revealed to Moses. Fourth, this means it's not only applicable to Israel. It's the whole world. Us. And this in the end is what it is all about. This is where the rubber meets the road. It is not just Israel who is accountable to God, it is everyone. It is not just Israel who will be judged by the law of God, it is the whole world, you and me included. And this, of course, is why it is as relevant today as it was back then. We are also judged by the Bible. And the hidden conclusion we must come to, which the passage does not allude to, is that after we die, we will be judged according to the law of God by God Himself. And this brings us to the fifth and final point. Circle all the way back. There are two ways to respond to this information. Either like Amalek did, rebellion, futile rebellion, or like Jethro did, in worship. Each one of us will ultimately stand before God and be judged according to a standard independent of our own opinions of what is right and wrong. We will be judged according to the ultimate standard of what is right and wrong, God Himself. And here I would like to take the opportunity to expand on this briefly. What does this mean for us? In our earthly laws, we have distinctions between less serious and more serious crimes. Some things are not even serious enough to warrant being prosecuted. This is largely a practical consideration. Like Moses, earthly judges have limited capacity in time and effort required to judge, but also a limited understanding of the facts. We only know what we can know. And so earthly laws and judges draw a line for which matters are serious enough to be worth the time and effort to go through the whole system, to the whole motion. However, understand that there is no such limitation with God. God knows all things, He knows all the facts, and He has all the time in the world. He knows everything we have ever done, and He knows why. He knows the motivations of our heart. He knows exactly what the right judgment is for every situation. Now ask yourself, if you shall stand before the judge of heaven and earth, what will his verdict be? You may tell yourself, like, I've done many good deeds. And surely when I stand before God, He will acknowledge this. And you are right, He will. But just as standing before an earthly magistrate, the murderer does not get any credit for the people he didn't kill, no man will stand before God and be pardoned for all the sins he didn't commit. Our only hope when we stand before God on the day of the Lord is for our crimes to be forgiven. And the only way this can happen is if someone else carries out our sentence in our place. And how will this happen? If we believe in Jesus. There's only one name given under heaven by which we may be saved, the name of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ came into the world and he paid the penalty for our sins. And if we believe in him, then on that day, when we stand before God, Jesus will stand next to us. And when our sins are read out, and the question is what the sentence will be, Jesus will say, I have paid it all. Let's pray. Father, thank you that we can study